Welcome. My name's John Carroll. I'm Director of the School of Natural Resources here at the University of Nebraska, and we're glad to have you with us here today for the Heerman Lecture. Heerman Lectures in the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources focus on providing and sustaining enough food, natural resources, and renewable energy for the world's people, and on securing the sustainability of rural communities where the vital work of producing food and renewable energy occurs. They are made possible by a gift from Keith and Norma Heerman of Phillips, and along with their son Scott and his family are here today down in the front row. By the way, this lecture is being streamed live online, so we all have to be careful what we say. The typical format of these lectures will be a 40 to 50-minute lecture by our guest, followed by 20 to 30 minutes of questions and answers. We will have a couple of students floating around in the audience to help with getting the questions to our guest. We are in for a real treat today. I want to introduce Dr. Anthony Leiserowitz. He hails from Michigan, but he actually has Nebraska roots. His family has or had a farm in the vicinity of York, Nebraska, his grandparents' dairy farm. But I think he grew up mostly in Michigan. He went to Michigan State, where he was an international studies major focusing on the Cold War. And I think he was graduating right about 1989. Rather inconvenient time to be focusing on the Cold War. And so he joked at lunch today that he went from international relations in the Cold War to history. And so I think that he's had a couple of career shifts along the way, which I think helps him understand some of these complex issues he'll be talking about today. So he went on for a degree, and he finished his degree at Michigan State, went on and worked for a while, and then went back to get master's and PhD degrees at the University of Oregon, where he studied environmental sciences, but really focusing on policy issues. Presently, he is director of the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication and a research scientist at the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies at Yale University. He is a widely recognized expert on American and international public opinion on global warming, including public perception of climate change risk, support and opposition for climate policies, and willingness to make individual behavioral change. His research investigates the psychological, cultural, political, and geographic factors that drive public environmental perception and behavior. Pretty important when you're talking about climate. He has conducted survey, experimental, and field research at scales ranging from global to local, including international studies, the United States, individual states of Alaska and Florida, municipalities, New York City, and with Eskimos in Northwest Alaska. He has also conducted the first empirical assessment of worldwide public values, attitudes, and behaviors regarding global sustainability, including environmental protection, economic growth, and human development. He has served as a consultant to the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, the United Nations Development Program, and the Gallup World Poll, the Global Roundtable on Climate Change at the Earth Summit at Columbia University, and the World Economic Forum. He will report on recent trends in Americans' climate change knowledge, attitudes, policy support, and behavior, and discuss strategies for more effective public engagement. And for those scientists in the audience, this is, I think, something that we always need a little bit more in terms of our engagement with the public. And with that, I will leave it to Dr. Leiserowitz and carry on. Thank you. Thanks. That's okay.
So, first of all, sound check. Can you hear me in the back? Yes, great. Okay. So first of all, I just want to say thank you. Thank you so much to John and to Don Wilhite and all of your colleagues for inviting me to come today. It's such a pleasure to come back to Nebraska. I used to come to Nebraska, to York, Nebraska, every summer to see my grandfather, who actually for my 13th birthday did the one thing any all-American boy would want, is he gave me a prize blue ribbon cow. Which I took home. I grew up on a 79-acre farm in the middle of Michigan. So first of all, it's just great to be back. Thank you. And secondly, thank you to all of your colleagues who I've had a chance to talk to today. I've been so impressed with the great work that's being done here at Nebraska. Really exciting, and I love the innovative spirit, the interdisciplinary spirit that I found here, and that's just so wonderful to see. So first of all, thank you for that. And then also thank you to the Hiremans for sponsoring this lecture series. This is one of the greatest gifts I think can be given to a university, is essentially to promote platforms for the wrestling with big ideas. And so thank you for your support for this series. So what I'm going to talk about today is climate change in the American mind. Let me give a little more background about who we are and what we do at the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication. We really do two big things. First of all is research, and secondly is outreach. And as John just quickly described, we're interested in how do mass societies respond to the issue of climate change. What do they understand and misunderstand about the causes, the consequences, and the potential solutions? How do they perceive the risks, so the likelihood and severity of different kinds of impacts, like droughts or floods or fires, etc.? What kinds of policies do they support or oppose? And then what kinds of behaviors are they engaged in or willing to engage in? What barriers prevent them from changing behavior? And when I say behavior, we really look at four main types. First of all, how people actually use and conserve energy at home and on the road. Secondly is consumer behavior. To what extent will people prefer products and services that are more environmentally friendly? But one of the things that's actually been very interesting is looking at their willingness to reward or punish companies for their climate change actions. In other words, you can think of boycotts or boycotts. Turns out Americans certainly are much more willing to vote with their dollars than they are to vote at the ballot box on this particular issue. Third, we look at social behavior. What ways do we talk about climate change or not talk about climate change amongst our family, our friends, our broader social networks? As well as what role do social norms play, these unwritten cultural rules that shape much of our daily lives. And let me use just a very concrete example. When I grew up, smoking was everywhere. My dad smoked, there was smoking on airplanes, there was smoking in bars and restaurants. It was everywhere, and it was glamorized on television, on film, and so on. In this country, you've seen a complete inversion of that cultural norm, where smoking is no longer considered appropriate. If I was to light up a cigarette right here, right now, many people would recoil in disgust. Okay? That's not a law. That was a cultural shift in the way that we as a society now think about that particular behavior. And then last but not least is political behavior. To what extent will people not just support policies, but support particular elected officials, but also to what extent are people willing to become engaged as active citizens to demand that the system change? But in the end, of course, we're just nerdy scientists. Our ultimate question then is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people get really engaged with the issue of climate change, others are apathetic, and some are downright dismissive or hostile? Okay? And we'll explore some of those in a bit. And then also, just to emphasize what John was saying, we also work at many different scales. So here I'm going to talk about what's going on in the American mind, but we've been working increasingly at the international level. We did the first ever study in China, the first ever study in India. With the Gallup World Poll, we've been looking at this in about 120 countries around the world. And then increasingly, we're doing a lot more at the state and local level. Former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, Tip O'Neill, once very famously quipped, all politics is local. And that's absolutely true. And so really many of the decisions around both the response to climate change and the adaptation to climate change is going to happen at these state and local levels. And so we're doing a lot of work now to try to understand what's happening. But we also do a lot of outreach that really comes out of our research. And the one thing I'm just going to really talk about very quickly here is that about 6 months ago we started a new national radio program called Climate Connections. And the goal really is that second word, connections. Because we know that many people think of climate change as this far away, distant thing that doesn't seem related to our daily lives. When in fact, the evidence is all around us. The impacts are all around us. And more importantly, the solutions are all around us. So this series is a set of 90-second episodes. That's it, just 90 seconds. Every day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and actually KZUM here in Lincoln carries it right before 6 o'clock p.m. every night, so you can listen to it. And basically, it just tries to give voice to this issue, to hear the voices of everyday Americans who are experiencing this issue, being impacted by this issue, but more importantly, doing such incredible, innovative things to solve the problem. So anyway, happy to talk about any of these kinds of things as we get into the Q&A, but for the most part, I'm going to focus on what's going on here at the national level. I also should very quickly say that everything I'm going to talk about here isn't just the result of my own team, but we have an incredible network of scholars and researchers at different institutions around the country. And I especially want to call out and give thanks to my friends at the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication, with whom we've done much of this work. And then, of course, our sponsors, without whom none of this would be possible. So, as always, thank you so much. Okay. So let me begin with a basic proposition, especially given that I'm here at Nebraska and at a university that focuses so much on this issue. It would be great, it would be wonderful if everyone in America could have the equivalent of Climate Change 101. A full semester course dedicated to understanding the causes, the consequences, the potential solutions to climate change, as well as just how the climate system itself works. That would be wonderful. Full 3-month course devoted to really understanding this. But that's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. Most people are far too busy. They don't have the background, they don't have the training, they don't have the interest, they just don't have the time to actually do the equivalent of Climate Change 101. Now, I'm not saying there aren't, in fact, millions of people who do want answers. They do. And they're asking for answers about how does climate change work? What does it mean for my locality? What do we do about it? And we, as a scientific community, need to do all we can to go more than halfway to meet them and answer those questions. But that's not most people. Again, most people have far too much going on in the rest of their lives to have much depth of knowledge about climate change. So the challenge is, let's just assume that there's enough space in most people's heads for 5 ideas about climate change. Okay? So the question then is, what 5 ideas would you want them to know that allows them to make sense of this issue today, but also to make informed decisions about this issue for the next decades, because we will be dealing with this for decades. Okay. Do they need to know exactly how the carbon cycle works? Do they need to know exactly how many parts per million of carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere? Do they need to be able to define radiative forcing? Okay. I don't think so. I think in the end, based on our own work and the work of some of our colleagues, we've actually boiled it down to 5 key, what I would call meta facts. That in fact, we've been able to boil down to just 10 words. So for all the complexity of this issue and all the complexity of this science, and it is complex, the key things that most people need to know are actually very simple. Now this is the 10 words in this form. A friend of mine has converted this into a haiku. I won't give you that version. But look, these are pretty simple. 1, it's real. It's happening. The evidence is overwhelming that it is happening. Secondly, it's us. this time, let me extend, of course the climate has changed naturally over millions and even billions of years of prior Earth history. No question about it. But this time it's different. This time it's the direct result of human activities all over the world, most notably the digging up and burning of fossil fuels at an unbelievably fast rate, basically injecting the stored CO2 over hundreds of millions of years directly back into the atmosphere in the blink of a geologic eye. Third, it's bad. It's bad now, and it's going to get much, much worse if we continue on the current path. Fourth, scientists agree. And I'll have more to say about this in a moment, but this is a critical, basic understanding for most people that has very important consequences, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then last but not least, there's hope. In fact, most of the solutions to this issue are already in hand. It isn't going to require some massive major breakthrough like cold fusion, though if anybody here at Nebraska happens to be working on cold fusion and can crack that one, let me know. I'll invest. There's much that we can do already, and yet most of us don't really know that. And last thing I want to say about these is that these are all what we can call meta ideas. Okay? Each one of these is deceptively simple, but on any of these, there are dozens of points that can be made and examples of all the ways we know that it's bad. Okay? Here's all the different kinds of impacts it's going to have on both human societies and natural ecosystems around the world. We can come up with thousands of examples of that. But each one of those examples is essentially reinforcing the basic fundamental fact that it's bad. Okay? And I'm saying is that you can do that with each one of these ideas. Okay, so how are we doing about those ideas here in the United States? So what I'm going to start showing you now is the results of our national a whole series of national studies. These are nationally representative survey studies. I'm happy to talk about methodology to anyone who wants, but I don't want to put you to sleep right now. So first of all, I'm showing you data starting back in 2008 to October of 2014. We're actually in the field right now, so we'll have an update on these numbers just in a week or two. But this is, do Americans think that global warming is happening? And as of last October, 2/3 of Americans said, yes, I think global warming is real. But the other pattern I want to point out that's an important one, because we're going to see it again and again, is this right here. That basically we reached a high water mark in this country of understanding that climate change is real back in 2007 and 2008. And then we saw this dramatic drop, about 14 percentage points. And by the way, this is not just our results, this is Gallup, this is Pew. I mean, everybody that's been asking these questions over time found the same basic pattern. And then it dropped down, bottoming out about 2010, and then it's burbled along, and now we're right about here. So coming up, not quite back up to where we were. Okay, so 2/3 of Americans just a couple months ago said, yes, it's happening. But only 50% say that it's human caused. With just about 1/3 saying it's natural. Okay, now that's of course immensely consequential, because if global warming is just natural, then it's nothing we had anything to do with. We can't really do much about. It's just part of natural cycles. But that's of course not what the scientific truth is. The scientific truth is that it is human caused. And that has enormous consequences, because it means we actually have the power within ourselves, within human society, to choose a different path. Whether we do so is up to us. And then this point is also really important. So we've been asking Americans variants of this question for quite a while, and we've seen that there is just enormous misunderstanding about the state of the scientific consensus, meaning that there have been multiple studies using very different techniques that have tried to estimate what level of agreement is there among the experts, climate scientists, the people who study this for a living, who do this day in and day out. What proportion of them accept the basic facts, that it's happening, that it's human caused, about which there is really no dispute. And all of those studies zero in at about 95 to 97% of practicing climate scientists. But the vast majority of Americans have no idea. Only 1 in 10 Americans knows that it's in that range, between 90 and 100%. Okay. Now, this is highly consequential. We actually just published a paper a couple days ago where we've identified this as what we call a gateway belief. Okay? That people, once they understand that scientists have concluded based upon the evidence that global warming is happening and human-caused, themselves say, well then, gee, I think it's probably happening, and I think it's human-caused, and I think it's a serious problem, and in turn, they're more likely to support policy action and even be more willing to take action themselves. And that makes perfect sense. Because if you're a layperson and you don't know much about this issue, and most people don't, if your perception is that the scientists are still arguing with themselves over whether this is even real, then most people feel like, you know, I'm going to just take a wait-and-see attitude. Scientists, you go off in a room, you're going to argue it out, you're going to figure out what the answer is, and then you're going to tell me, right? Not knowing, of course, that the scientific community did that decades ago. And really, this is not an accident. This is two main things. One is it's partly the fault of the climate science community. We're not particularly good communicators. And in particular, we're not very good at repeating something that we established literally decades, if not even longer ago. Because in our world of scientists, we don't get credit for saying old things over and over again. No one has published a paper in the past 10 years that says, aha, gravity exists. Okay? That's been accepted. So I don't get any credit by saying gravity exists. Likewise, I don't get any credit by repeating the fact that global warming is real and human-caused. Okay? So we don't tend to communicate that. But the extent that there is a simple formula, there is no simple formula, but this one is at least useful as a guideline, is that you need simple, clear, and compelling messages, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often, repeated often. Usually at least 7 times. In fact, it's about the time that you're so sick of hearing the words come out of your mouth again that that's about the time your audience is finally hearing you for the first time. Okay? So one is that as a community, we haven't been particularly good at this. But it's also because there's been a massive, well-funded, and very well-run disinformation campaign for many years, which again has been very well documented. And in fact, I would encourage those of you who can to go see actually a new documentary film that's just been released last week called Merchants of Doubt, based on the book written by Harvard historian Naomi Oreskes, which documents how this particular strategy was developed in the tobacco wars. Okay? Because decades ago, the tobacco companies realized, and in fact their own documents show that they knew that nicotine was addictive and harmful for human health. And that's pretty bad when that's your primary product. That's how you make your money. If the public only knew that, we're going to lose business. So they came up with an explicit strategy that literally said, doubt is our product. We need to convince Americans that the experts are still arguing about whether smoking is bad for you. And they successfully played that strategy for decades and raked in billions of extra dollars by playing that. That exact same strategy, including some of the exact same scientists who were disputing the link between cigarette smoking and human health, are the same strategies and people that have been brought into the climate debate. Okay? And it's been highly effective. I give full credit to how good they've been, because they've been great. Because as we see, very few Americans understand the nature of scientific agreement. So that's a big one that still needs to change. And we see consistently in our data that most Americans are just not very worried about this issue. As of our last study, only 11% of Americans said that they were very worried about climate change. Now, why is that? Well, there's a variety of reasons, but one of the most important ones is something that we've seen consistently through our research over many, many years. And that is that for many Americans, they think of climate change as a distant problem. Distant in time, that this is about a generation or more away, the impacts, or this is distant in space. This is about polar bears, or maybe some small island countries in the Pacific, but not the United States, not Nebraska, not Lincoln, not the university, not any of my friends or family, or any of the people and places I care about. So as a result, it's seen as a psychologically distant problem, something that's out there. Maybe I kind of wish somebody would do something about it, but I don't see why it relates to my life. And as a result, it's not seen as a national priority. And I'm sure you've seen this before. This is data from the Pew Research Center. Our own surveys show the same thing. And that is, whenever you ask Americans what are the top priorities for the President and Congress, global warming is always at the bottom of that list. And moreover, here, from 2007, that high water mark, it dropped 9 percentage points. Okay. Now, we have one other way that we get at these questions that's one of my favorite questions of all time, and I won't go into the underlying psychology, but since I have a completely non-representative sample of the American public here, we can play along. Okay, so here's the question we always ask in our national surveys, and it's very simple. What's the first thought or image that comes to mind when you hear the words global warming? Now, don't say anything. Okay, now out of curiosity, please raise your hand if you're thinking of something to do with melting ice. So sea ice retreating on the Arctic Ocean, Antarctica, melting glaciers around the world. Up high, please, where we can look at them. Yeah, it works every time. It's amazingly how psychic I am, because that's exactly what we see among the American public as well. These first associations are incredibly powerful, incredibly informative about what is going on. And what we see is that melting ice is one of the very first things that most people think of. By the way, this data comes from 2003. I'll show you more recent data in a moment. Now, first of all, why do we think of melting ice? Okay? Because think about how hard it is to depict and visualize climate change or global warming. Think about it. You're a newspaper editor. Someone brings you an article and you're saying, all right, photo, get me a photo of global warming. And what do they always come back with? You got it, a picture of melting ice, maybe with a polar bear on it. Okay? Television, what do they love to show? Pictures of icicles dripping water or big pieces of big chunks of ice falling off a glacier, right? Which is great television, this giant piece of ice and water, big splashes, it's great TV. Okay? And you've seen those icons associated with global warming over and over and over again. Okay? And on the one hand, that's useful because it resonates with, it connects with a mental model that we've all built up intuitively in our bones about this issue. So let me just put it this way. If we were to walk outside on a warm summer day with a glass of ice, what happens? What happens? It melts. See, I didn't have to give you any physics. I didn't have to show you any charts. You know exactly what happens, right? And so when you show people pictures of melting ice around the world, many people say, quite rightly, they go, oh, wow, geez, global warming must be real. But there's also a problem with this particular icon, okay? So everybody who is thinking of melting ice, could you put your hand back up high, please? Up high, where we can all see it. Thank you. Now, I want you to keep the hand up if you live on the shores of the Arctic Ocean, in Antarctica, or next to a melting glacier. Not one person in this room? Yeah. It reinforces the sense that this is distant. It reinforces the sense that this is something happening at the poles or at high altitudes, not where we live. And moreover, people aren't connecting the dots to why we actually care about melting ice. Okay? Most people say, okay, global warming causes melting. But they don't then go, well, that melting, especially of land ice, is going to lead to rising sea levels, which may actually impact the coast where I live. And what they really don't understand is what I think most of us within the scientific community are much more worried about. That melting of ice, especially in the Arctic, opens up open water, because that ice turns to water, and ice is reflective. It has a very high, what we call albedo effect. It reflects solar energy back into outer space, cooling the Earth. When you convert it to open, dark ocean, it now absorbs all that energy and actually speeds up the warming. So the warming causes melting, which leads to more warming, which leads to more melting, which leads to more warming, which leads to more melting in a runaway spiral. Okay? Most people don't understand that's why one of the main reasons why we care so much about what's happening in the Arctic, because what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. Take a play on Las Vegas. Okay. Secondly, a number of people just think of rising temperatures, global warming, temperatures going up. Then there are a bunch of people who think of global warming, they think of the ozone hole, and I won't go into that. It's a fascinating story, but many people continue to confuse and conflate these two very different issues. So if I can do nothing else, there's global warming over here and ozone hole over here. They are separate issues. Okay? Global warming is not going to give you skin cancer. Okay? They are separate issues. Then there are a group of people that we call alarmists. These are people who have extreme, apocalyptic kind of visions of what global warming will bring. They say things like death of the planet, or like after nuclear war, or all life dead. I mean, visions that go way beyond even the worst case scientific scenarios. Then those that think of flooding sea level rise, impacts on the overall climate system, impacts on non-human nature, not people. And then last but not least are those that we call the naysayers. And these are people who don't believe for a variety of reasons. Some simply deny it. They say it's not happening. Then there are those that say, well, it could be happening, but I just don't think the evidence has shown it yet. So they're at least engaging at the level of evidence. Then there are those that doubt based on their own personal experience. I mean, come on, it was really cold this winter. I mean, global warming can't possibly be happening. Okay? There is a reason why we call it global warming, not local warming, because you can't extrapolate from your own immediate experience to the entire world. Stephen Colbert once said, great news, world hunger is over because I just ate. Then there are those that blame it on media or environmentalist hype, and then last but not least, those that we lovingly call the conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away American sovereignty, it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends, and many, many other such narratives. Okay? All right. One last thing that I want to say about this that is one of the most important things that we see is what we do not see. In all the years that we've been asking this question, no one associates global warming with impacts on human health. Nobody says anything about allergies. Nobody says anything about asthma. Nobody says anything about infectious diseases. Nobody says anything about the impacts of extreme weather itself. It's like there's global warming in one part of people's brains and health in another part of the brain, and no one has ever connected the dots between them. And yet we know that when you inform people about the health risks of climate change, people get much more engaged. They go, wait, what? It's not just about polar bears? It's about us? So very important. Okay, so like I said, this data is from 2003. Here now is where we were as of 2010 at the bottom of that slide, that decline. Now you've probably noticed that there's one major change in particular, and that is these free associations suddenly skyrocket in the naysayer category. And about half of these are now conspiracy type imagery. Okay, so why? What was going on? So in some ways, there was just a perfect storm. I mean, this is 2008 when the beginning of this major decline happens. And so in part, there's a lot of stuff happening, though we're currently working through to try to disentangle each of these and figure out exactly what was the most important. But first, it's obvious. Context is the economy. The economy, the economy. 2008 is when the housing bubble pops, the financial crisis hits, unemployment surges up over 10%, and jobs and the economy soar to the top of public priorities where they have dwarfed everything else ever since. So that's not hard to understand. When you're afraid of losing your job, your mortgage is suddenly underwater, you're seeing foreclosure signs, and all of that, of course, people get very focused on those threats. But what's less recognized is what happened to media coverage. So my colleague Max Boykoff at University of Colorado tracks newspaper coverage of climate change and found that in this critical period it dropped by 2/3. Bob Rule at Drexel tracks nightly news coverage, the CBS Evening News, ABC Nightly News, etc. It dropped 90%. And it's not like it was getting a whole lot of attention even back in 2007. Our own analysis, where we look at all news coverage for the year of 2007, newspapers, magazines, radio, cable television, nightly news, all that coverage, how often was global warming or climate change mentioned? 0.9%. Okay? And by 2011, it had dropped to 0.1%. It doesn't even register when you map it out on a single chart. It's far below much more important stories like Balloon Boy, the death of Michael Jackson 3 years later, the marriage of the royals in England and so on. There are so many other things that we focus our time on in the media as opposed to this particular one. And it's a major reason why we just don't think about it and we just don't talk about it, because it's not there. And that's the critical point, that for most people, global warming is invisible. Okay? The only reason we know about it is because of what most of us learn about it through the media. We don't know scientists. Most Americans can't even name one. Only 1 in 200 says they even know a scientist. There was a survey a couple years ago that asked Americans to name a living scientist. Most couldn't do it, and the two of the most commonly cited living scientists were Einstein and Darwin. If only they were still alive. And I hate to break it to my colleagues here at the University of Nebraska, but they're not reading your papers. They're not reading your reports. They've never heard of the IPCC. Okay? So they're not getting it directly from you. It's being mediated by the media. Okay? And moreover, the ultimate cause of this issue is something that we just can't see. Now, if this room had windows, we could all look outside right this very moment, and there is CO2 pouring out of tailpipes. There's CO2 pouring out of buildings. There's CO2 pouring out of smokestacks. There's CO2 coming out of your mouth and nose this very second. But until I said it, you weren't conscious of it, because it's invisible. You see that? So I want you to just take a moment in your mind's eye and imagine with me for a second. The next time you go outside, and just try to imagine what you're actually standing in the middle of. Here in the middle of Lincoln, you're actually standing in a volcano of CO2 that is rising up out of this city up into the atmosphere. And there's another one in Denver, and another one in Las Vegas, and in Los Angeles, and in Shanghai, and in Tokyo, and London, and DC. But we can't see it. We don't know where to look. And so when the media doesn't report the issue, it's literally out of sight and out of mind. Now, one of the first things that's now come up is this simulation by NASA, which hopefully will work, which allows us for the first time to, at least in a simulated way, see what that CO2 actually looks like across the world. Okay, this is for the year 2006, and we've just reached January 26th. And you can just see how, or visualize how the CO2 that's coming out of our daily activities works its way around the world. And it's fast. Okay? CO2 doesn't just go up and then come back down the way that old pollution does. When it goes up in the atmosphere, it diffuses very quickly around the entire world. Your own breath, it is said, within weeks to months, is suddenly dispersed throughout the atmosphere, making it a very different kind of pollutant than what we've been used to in the past. Okay, this is a gorgeous thing, and actually at some point you'll start to see the fires really emerge down here in Africa and in South America as well. But in the meantime, I'll let it go. So again, when the media doesn't report this issue, it's literally out of sight and out of mind for most people because they don't know where to look. We also, in this critical period, had a couple unusual cold weather events. Especially in the east part of the country, had snowmageddon and then snowpocalypse. We're running out of these terms, which we know that some people will draw upon their most recent experience to make up their mind. Okay? So some people, when they have a really cold winter, will say, gosh, that doesn't seem like global warming. But on the flip side, when they experience a really hot summer, they're more likely to say, oh yeah, that seems like global warming. Okay? It's not the correct way to understand a global problem, but nonetheless, some people do it. I've already talked about the denial industry. ClimateGate happens in this time period. If those of you who remember, there were emails hacked from a server at the University of East Anglia in the UK. And basically people went through those, cherry-picked out a few sentences that made it seem like scientists were making it all up and that they had found some sort of smoking gun. There have been 6 independent scientific investigations of that whole thing, and there was absolutely no wrongdoing. It was a classic example of cherry picking and quoting out of context, but nobody knows that because the damage had already been done. And we found in our own research is that about 12% of Americans became less convinced that climate change is happening and less trustful of climate scientists as a result of this scandal. Okay? But interestingly, that effect was not universally spread throughout the American public. It was highly concentrated among conservatives, Republicans, people who get their news and information from Fox and Rush. Okay? And we had other colleagues that went back and actually looked. How did the media report this? And yes, the CBS Evening News and others reported the story once or twice. But it was on Fox and in Rush where the story came up over and over and over and over again, and always with this very sinister interpretation that this was the proof that it was all made up. Okay? So you're beginning to see how our society has changed. We no longer live in the Walter Cronkite world where most of us are all listening to the same single source telling us about how the world works. We've now fragmented, incredibly fragmented, into a world where you can increasingly surround yourself in a media environment where you only hear the things that validate what you already believe. Okay? This is the creation of echo chambers in the media environment. And then last but not least is the increasing political polarization. And actually I think this is one of the most important things. This is an issue, believe it or not. Here I am in 2015, and I'm going to say that in 1997, Democrats and Republicans were basically together on this, accepting that global warming was real, that it was human caused, that it was serious. It's hard to believe, because this issue has now become the most partisan issue in America. Climate change. More partisan even than health care. But 97 is the turning point. And what happens in 97 is that you had Bill Clinton and his Vice President Al Gore who go to Kyoto and sign an international agreement that they never submitted to the Senate for ratification because they knew it wasn't going to pass. But ever since that moment, the issue has become further and further and further politically polarized until we are to where we are today, where it's almost identity politics, where Democrats are fully convinced climate change is real, and most Republicans are like, I don't know, or worse, that it's a complete hoax. Okay? That political dynamic is really important, and one of the things that happens in this critical time period is the rise of the Tea Party and very strong conservative viewpoints that we'll get back to in just a bit. Okay. But since then, we've seen the numbers beginning to shift back up again. And why is that? Well, in part, it's because the economy and unemployment are, in fact, improving. What are we down to now? 5.5% unemployment, which is reasonably pretty good. Increasing media coverage, in large part because we have seen in this country in the past number of years since 2010, a number of years with just all-time record-setting extreme events. And what we're seeing in our own data is that about 57% of Americans now say that global warming is affecting weather in the United States. And then rightly or wrongly, many Americans are now even saying that global warming has been intensifying or making specific events worse, such as the fact that at the time, 2012 was the warmest year on record. The ongoing drought that you were experiencing here in the Midwest back then, about half of Americans thought so, whereas only 17% said it was having no impact. The rest said they didn't know. Superstorm Sandy, a massive snowstorm that literally landed at my house. I was the epicenter for Nemo. Literally in one day we had this much snow. So anyway, people are beginning to connect the dots. And it's not simple. I mean, it's not like people experience a drought or experience a flood and suddenly go, oh my God, I got it. It's global warming and it's really serious. No, people are much more complicated than that. We know that some people that are firmly committed in their positions aren't going to change those opinions based upon the weather. In fact, what they do is they engage in what we call motivated reasoning. This is a psychological term and concept that basically means that humans have a tendency that when you firmly, strongly, emotionally are committed to a particular viewpoint, we are predisposed to ignore any evidence that contradicts what we believe. Okay? Or to deny any evidence that contradicts what we believe, or even to distort any evidence that contradicts what we believe and say, oh, no, that actually supports my viewpoint. Okay? And what we know is you can see that behavior on both sides, so to speak, of the extremes. There are those that are firmly convinced of global warming that will sometimes make attributions that just aren't true, or that we just don't have any backing for. Like, I remember a few years ago when the terrible tornado destroyed Joplin, Missouri. Oh, terrible tragedy. And you heard some people within the climate change advocacy community saying, aha, global warming. No known scientific connection there. But on the other side, you have those people who, we have the polar vortex, and who are firmly convinced that global warming isn't happening. In fact, we just saw this a week ago where Senator James Inhofe brought a snowball on the floor of the US Senate and threw it at the presiding officer saying, there's your proof that global warming is not happening, because there was snow in Washington, D.C. So we see that kind of motivated reasoning happening at those extremes. But in the middle, most people don't have firm views about this. And they're the ones who are the most likely to change their views based on what they're experiencing and what they're seeing. And what we're seeing is that these extreme events are teachable moments. They're one of the rare times in American daily life where we're actually focused on something that has a connection to climate change. Not getting the kids to school and worrying about our parents' health and what's going on in our job, or who's up and who's down in American Idol and all the really important things of life. Instead, we get focused on extreme weather, and especially record-setting extreme weather, that in many cases has some climate connection. And what people are beginning to do is actually connect the dots, not the single event. So there's an old wonderful saying that if something happens once, it's just happenstance. If it happens twice, it's a coincidence. If it happens 3 times, you're beginning to see a pattern. And if it happens 4, 5, 7, 12, 18, 20, 25 times of all-time record-setting events, many people start scratching their head and saying, what is going on? Could this have something to do with climate change? And they really want to know. So those are teachable moments. Okay, now I don't want to leave you with the impression that Americans are just hopelessly divided on this issue, because in many ways they aren't. Okay? Even though that's the common narrative. So let's just look at some of the major policies that would actually be required to deal with this issue. Not all policies, but at least some. And we've seen consistently over the years that Americans actually support a number of things, like funding more research into renewable energy. That has been a bipartisan, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, and conservatives all support this basic notion of we need to move to a new energy system. Okay? If I can paraphrase, for many Americans, they basically are saying, why are we still dependent on an energy system that is dated from the 1800s, that involves essentially digging stuff up out of the ground and setting it on fire? Can't we invent an energy system that's worthy of the 21st century? And of course the answer is yes, it's happening all around us. This is an unbelievable fulcrum turning point in human history, where just as we moved from wood energy to the incredible bounty of fossil fuels and everything that made possible, I mean, it's here. It's in the lights, it's in our clothes, it's in our food, it's in these buildings. Fossil fuels have been an unbelievable benefit for our society. But now we have to get beyond them, because the negative consequences of that particular energy source is catching up with us really fast. Okay? And yet we're seeing the development of whole new energy sectors. The shift to clean energy is going to dwarf the computer industry or the cell phone industry or all of those wrapped together. Okay? There are literally trillions of dollars in play in just the next few years as the world moves to clean energy. So one is, many people have been big supporters of that for a very long time. Regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. In all the years we've been asking this question, there's strong support by the American public, again, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, for regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. That is the major debate that's going on in the nation right this very moment, because this is the regulation of power plants for their carbon emissions. And so on. Okay. But another critical thing that we learned early in our work, of course, is that Americans don't have a single viewpoint on this issue. In fact, through the course of our research, we've identified what we call global warming's 6 Americas. And this is really useful because it's, first of all, it gets us away from the way that we usually talk about this, is that there are believers and there are deniers, as if you could actually adequately describe Americans as either believers or deniers, which is just frankly completely wrong. And because fundamentally, one of the first rules of effective communication, of education, of good family relations is know your audience. Who are they? What do they know or think they know? What emotions do they have activated when they talk about that topic, whatever it is? What are their underlying values? Where do they get their information? Who do they trust? How can you engage them in a successful way? So first, you need to know who your audience is, or I like to say it's like playing darts in a crowded bar with the lights out and a blindfold on. You might hit the target sometimes by luck, but most times you're going to miss. And sometimes you're going to actually hit somebody else in the crowd, and they're going to come after you. Okay? So it's really important to think about who am I communicating to. And so here are the 6 Americas. Let me introduce you to them. The first is a group we call the alarmed. 13% of the public as of last fall. These are people who are convinced that climate change is happening, it's human-caused, it's serious, it's urgent, they strongly support policy. Okay? So these are the people who are the most engaged with this issue, and that's about 40 million people. Then comes a group we call the concerned. That's about 31%. These are people who also think it's happening, it's human-caused, it's a serious problem, but again, they tend to think of it as distant in time, distant in space. So they say, it's important, I wish somebody would do something about it, but it's not a high priority. In fact, this is probably one that we can stick on the back burner, not knowing that the pot's actually boiling over on the back burner. Then a group we call the cautious. These are people still on the fence. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it serious, or is it kind of overblown? Paying attention, but just haven't really made up their mind. Kind of confused by the shouting that they hear. Then a very interesting group we call the disengaged. These are people who say, you know what, I've heard of global warming, but I don't know anything about it. I don't know what the causes are. I don't know what the consequences are. Certainly don't know what the solutions are. I don't know anything about it. It's basic awareness is the primary barrier for them. Then a group we call the doubtful. These are people who say, I don't think it's real. But if it is, it's natural. Nothing humans had anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about. So I don't think about it that much. I certainly don't see it as much of a risk, but I'm predisposed to not see it as a serious concern. And then last but not least are the dismissive. Again, firmly convinced it's not happening, it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem. And again, most of them are conspiracy theorists. Now note that they're only 13%. They're only 13%. But they're a really loud 13%. They're a really vocal 13%. They're a 13% that's really well represented in the halls of Congress. Okay? And in fact, we've done analyses of things like, and you've all seen this, you read a newspaper article online about climate change, and then you look at the comments after that article, and half or more of those comments will come from people in this camp, right? So it's really easy to come away as a member of the public or as a journalist or as a policymaker with the false impression that half or more of the country thinks this is all a big bogus hoax. But it's not true. They're only 13%. Okay? Now just to reinforce the understanding that this is, there are totally different conversations happening in this country at the exact same time, we've asked Americans, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, what question would you ask? And these down here, are the doubtful and dismissive are asking, so how do you know that global warming is happening or human caused? And on a deeper level, they're asking, and why should I trust you? Whereas these groups in the middle are saying, okay, maybe it's real, but so what? Why should I care? Whereas the alarmed and concerned are saying, okay, I got it. It's happening. It's human caused. It's serious. But what do we do? What can I do? What can we do? And that's actually another failing of the climate community, is that we've actually done a far better job describing the problem and the threat than we have what the solutions are. And what we're beginning to hear from some of these folks, just a little bit, a few of them, are starting to ask, and is it too late? And that's a really dangerous attitude. Because once you slip into fatalism, then you're done. To quote Henry Ford, who once beautifully said, those who think they can and those who think they can't are both right. Okay, one last point, and that is the role of values. So one of the other really important things that we see in the complexity of the human response to this issue is the importance of values. And what we find is that the people who are at this alarmed end of the spectrum have what we call strong egalitarian values. They tell us that they care deeply about discrimination in this country, that the government should be trying to eradicate poverty, that gross inequities in wealth, both within the United States and between other countries, is a source of conflict, and so on and so forth. Okay? All of those have nothing directly to do with climate change, and yet people with that value system care deeply about climate change. In particular, about the injustice of climate change, that those who have reaped the vast majority of the benefits of the burning of fossil fuels are not the same people or species or generations that are going to suffer most of the consequences. But by contrast, people down here in the dismissive end of the spectrum have what we call a strong individualistic worldview. That for them, the preeminent value above all other values is individual liberty, individual freedom, individual autonomy, which is often framed as anti-government. The government's too big, it's too intrusive, it's the nanny state, it's not your friend, it's your enemy. Too much taxation, too much regulation, and so on and so forth. In the great words of Grover Norquist, I want to shrink government to the size that I can drown it in a bathtub. Okay? For them, they're the most hostile to the issue of climate change. Now, why? Okay? Turns out that they're afraid of this issue. Not in the same way that the alarmed are afraid. The alarmed are afraid of the impacts. These folks are afraid of the issue too because they're afraid of the policy response. Because this is one of the ultimate collective action problems. There's no way that you, I, and all of us collectively, through pure, voluntary, virtuous action, by turning out the lights and buying a more efficient car and changing some of the way we eat and all that kind of stuff, that we can collectively solve this problem. Okay, I've got colleagues who've tried to assess that what would happen if everyone in America did good common sense things that would have a net benefit for our health and our wallet and all of that stuff. It turns out that we could collectively reduce our emissions nationally by about 10%, which is big, which is important, which would be a great contribution of individuals to solving this problem, because there is no one solution. There is no silver bullet. But it's only 10%. The fact is that it's going to require the coordinated action of communities and cities and states and, yes, the national government and, yes, even the world, because the United States can't solve this by itself. We have to work together with all the other countries of the world to address this effectively. It's going to therefore require government. And as soon as you say that, for some people, they start seeing visions of black helicopters. Okay? Climate change has become just another front in a much deeper struggle in the United States over, it's actually one of the oldest struggles in the United States, about what is the proper role of a government in a society of free individuals. This goes all the way back to our founding, and we are still having that argument to this very day. Climate change is a small skirmish compared to, say, the war that's been going on in this country for the past few years over health care, which is essentially the same struggle. What's the role of government in improving the health of Americans? Should it just be up to the individual to do it, or should the government be able to mandate that everyone have health insurance? Same basic struggle. Okay, and so that plays out in some of these policies. The alarmed love regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. Dismissive hate it. It's government regulation. I hate government regulation. A requirement that 20% of all electricity produced by utilities has to come from clean energy. The alarmed love it. The dismissive hate it. Government mandates. But then there are those policies that everybody supports, like clean energy. Okay? Now why? Why would the alarmed and the dismissive support clean energy? Well, let me describe this best through a story. In the state of Georgia, The primary monopoly energy producer and distributor is a company called Georgia Power. And Georgia Power, being a monopoly, is perfectly happy with the status quo. They're making their money by being the primary and, in fact, sole producer and distributor of electricity. And so what they didn't want is competition from homeowners who decided to put solar panels on their roof. And so they rigged the system so homeowners could not do it. So in Georgia, the Sierra Club partnered with the Atlanta Tea Party. Let me say that again. The Sierra Club partnered with the Tea Party to fight the monopoly energy producer. And they won. They beat them twice. And they changed the regulations, and now people can put solar panels on their roof and put that energy back into the grid. Okay? Now, why on earth would the Sierra Club and the Tea Party join together to do that? Well, the Sierra Club's easy. They care about climate change, and they see clean energy as a solution to climate change. The Tea Party doesn't believe in climate change. So why did they support it? Because it's about individual liberty. It's about individual freedom, consumer choice, and self-reliance. I want to be able to control my own energy destiny. And I don't like having to be dependent on some big corporate power over which generally doesn't listen to me. Okay? And that partnership turned out to be so successful that they've gone on to find other things that they agree about. They do not agree about everything, but they do agree about other stuff. And so they're now being affectionately called, wait for it, the Green Tea Party. Okay? Now that is the art of politics. Okay? That, or to use the old religious phrase, there are many roads to Damascus. Sometimes completely different interests can come to support the exact same policy for completely different reasons. And that's okay. Okay? Both sides were able to achieve their own values, their own goals. They didn't have to become the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club didn't have to become a Tea Partier. They could be themselves and yet find common cause in something that would achieve both of their aims. Okay? So sometimes there are solutions like that. There are also others where it's much more conflicted. All right, so just to sum up. As I've described, public understanding of climate change declined from 2008 to 2010, and it dramatically changed the national political climate. Americans, however, are beginning to connect the dots between climate change and extreme weather, with natural security, faith in values, and so on, and especially seeing global warming as not something far away in time and space, but actually here and now. Just as an aside, watch this space. One of the biggest things that's going to happen this year is that Pope Francis is about to release an encyclical on climate change. And while he has not told me exactly what's in that encyclical, all the signs are that it's going to be a very strong religious, moral argument that global warming is a moral problem. This is going to add an entirely new voice and a new perspective to what most people still see as a scientific debate or an environmental problem about polar bears or an argument between liberals and conservatives. We're about to hear the voice of the faith community in a much stronger way, though they've been doing a lot over the past decade, frankly. I think the greening of religion is one of the most exciting things happening out there. This is going to be a very interesting space to watch because he's not only going to release this encyclical, he's going to speak to a joint session of Congress, a Republican Congress, with a number of very well and prominent people running for president who are Catholic. Rick Santorum's a Catholic. Marco Rubio's a Catholic. Jeb Bush is a Catholic. I believe Chris Christie is a Catholic. Okay? How do they deal with that? Interesting. There are these 6 Americas, these 6 different audiences that each respond quite differently. The facts are always actively interpreted by these different audiences who are always constructing their understanding in accordance with what they know or think they know, their underlying emotions, which we haven't talked much about here, and their values. So knowledge is necessary, but it's insufficient. Emotion, values, ideology, these broader social, political, and economic forces all play important roles and sometimes even more important roles in shaping public responses. And a few key things that still need to be done is, again, to help people just understand the basic facts. It's real, it's us, it's bad, the experts agree, and that there's hope. Last thing is all of our results are available. We make all of our results available through reports. Please come to our website and come take a look. We update this very regularly. We do 2 national surveys a year, so we always have the latest information. And if you can, please try to listen to Climate Connections either on your own radio station right here or by podcast or even iTunes if you're interested. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Anthony. Outstanding lecture, and I am sure we have a whole lot of questions in the audience. We have 2 things left to do here. We have probably, let's say, 15 to 20 minutes worth of question time that we have available to us. And when we finish questions, I'll bring out Dean Archie Clutter to finish us up for today. Thank you. So we'll let Anthony take questions now. I'll let him be in charge of that, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so any questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks very much for your talk, Mas. Very, very interesting.
I'm sorry, could you hold it a little closer?
Sure.
There we go.
My question is regarding communication and the progress and the coming of new technologies or ongoing new technologies. Let's put them name social media. What do you think is or will be the role of social media communicating climate change?
Yes.
And let me perhaps complicate more this issue or add another perspective to here.
Yeah.
What may happen with the youth and with the children in that relationship, and how we can engage them more than what we unsuccessfully have engaged the elderly and the probably more mature audiences?
Yeah, okay, so the question for those who didn't hear it was, what role is social media and the massive shift we've seen in social media going to play around this issue? And I think the other question was especially related to is kids and younger generations. How might they respond? Okay, so look, we're in the midst of one of the great revolutionary transitions in human history. I mean, let's just face it. Like I was talking about before, I mean, the idea of all of us sitting around the television and watching Walter Cronkite every night seems so quaint, right? I mean, this man, believe it or not, for those of you who remember, he used to close every single broadcast with, "And that's the way it is on April 27th, 1972. I mean, can you imagine anybody saying that's the way it is in today's world? Okay, so no, we've seen this enormous, unbelievable quantum shift in our ability to communicate with one another. It's stunning how fast, how rapidly it's changing. Let me just take one example to answer your question, is what's going on in the developing world right now. Okay? There are billions of people on this planet who still don't even have electricity. They don't even have a light bulb. But they have a cell phone. They have a cell phone. And they're beginning to communicate about things like farming practices and climate change through cell phones. People who haven't even been to school, they don't know how to read. And yet, because of networks of sharing of information, farmers in India are now getting information about new pests that they've never seen before, and yet they're now patched together so people across regions can say, oh yeah, we saw that particular bug here a year ago, and here's how you fix it. Okay? Information they never could have had before. This is going to absolutely revolutionize the way we all deal with this issue on every level, from learning the basics to adapting and figuring out how do we live with the consequences. It's also opened up a whole new world for scientists, because scientists, in their primary dominant past model, is that you do your paper, you do your research, you write a paper, you publish it in a journal, and maybe 4 or 5 other people in the world ever read it. Okay? We're now in a world where scientists can communicate directly with the public at large, or at least that part of the public that's interested. And like I said before, there are in fact millions of Americans and other people around the world who do want to know more. There are scientists with enormous Twitter followings. right? Because people want to know more about this issue. And that's revolutionary. That's the ability to get rid of the media, the news media, and communicate directly with people who are interested. Now, is that enough? No, because it also comes with the proliferation of, like I was talking before, of this fragmented, ever smaller, more nichified echo chamber interest groups. And that's not even the political stuff. I mean, like, there are online clubs dedicated to people who collect coonskin caps, okay? Those people were isolated and alone in the past. Now they found each other, okay? There's a community. And that's glorious and wonderful on some levels. I mean, my father had COPD, and he was able, through the internet, to find thousands of other people across the United States who had the exact same thing he did, and they were a support group. They could help deal with the emotions and everything else, as well as the medical advice, and here's what you can do, here's what you shouldn't do. Unbelievable power in that, right? So I think we don't fully know yet what the outcomes of this is going to be, but it's clearly revolutionizing the way we interact. Great question, thank you. Another question? Yeah, all the way in the back, up high.
My question is on overpopulation.
Yeah.
And why aren't the climate people talking about it? It seems if we reduce the world population, that solves a lot of the issues.
Yeah, okay, so the question is about overpopulation and what role does that play? So there's a lot of stuff going on wrapped up in that question, but I'd say one of the most important things to always keep in mind is that while population is important, it's not the only thing that goes on. So one of the oldest formulas for impact, it literally was impact equals population times affluence times technology. And let's just use some concrete examples. There's over 1 billion people in India, and yet their carbon emissions per capita compared to the US are minuscule. Okay? We have far fewer people, but our affluence is much higher. And the technology we use to generate our electricity is much higher. We're not doing, wood burning, we don't cook with wood burning fires inside our huts. Okay? So population is important, absolutely, because in the end we're going to have, well, we already have 7 billion people on this planet. We're probably going to have something close to 9 to 10 billion. And the question is, how do we provide lives of quality? Okay? Good, basic, subsistence lives to all of those people without destroying the life support systems on which we all depend. That's, to my mind, climate change is important and all that, but it actually pales in significance to the big question of this century, which is, can we find a way to live sustainably with quality life for everyone on this planet without breaking those life support systems? That's the real question of this century. And so, yes, population is one of those drivers, but it's only one of those drivers. So, okay, another question, please. Oh, yes, sir.
I find it kind of interesting that you can't find anybody. I don't know whether people believe in global warming or not. I've really never asked a lot of people that question, but small town managers of water systems, electric systems, road, street departments, those that respond to emergency management, business leaders, farmers, there's tremendous changes. I was sitting with a group of business leaders the other day. We were comparing my office with their businesses, and we all have a common denominator. We have changed our electric use, and our electric bill has gone up. Our electric bill has gone up because our usage has gone down, the rate had to go up, and there's a surcharge added to keep the system operating with the reduced electric flow.
Okay.
Which is all over town. That's LED lights, that's everything going on.
Yeah.
I don't know, you survey these people, what they do and what they say is obviously a different thing because there's a tremendous change. Farmers have made tremendous change in hybrid selection, when they plant.
Yep.
You sit and talk to them about whether that's because of global warming or not, they wouldn't know what the answer would be.
Yeah.
But they've changed.
Yes. So a great point, and let me give you an international example of the exact same thing. So when we did a study of the public in India, okay, 2/3 of Indians have never heard of climate change. Never heard of it. And in fact, globally, you find that 4 in 10 people on the planet, 4 in 10 adults on the planet, have never heard of climate change before. But that doesn't mean that they haven't observed changes in their local weather patterns. Because what we found is that as soon as you provided them with just even a sentence describing what climate change is and how it affects local weather patterns, immediately people in India, over 70% of them said, yeah, that's happening, and that's really serious, and I think we need to take action to deal with it. So absolutely, you don't have to know about climate change to have observed changes in your own local environment, to begin recognizing your own vulnerability, and to begin taking action to, as best you can, deal with it. That's all true. But what they also don't have is climate change as a concept that makes sense of the changes that they're experiencing now, and more importantly, as a concept and as a framework to think about the decisions we're making for the future. Because, let me take India and all these other developing countries as a great example. They're making immense investments right now in roads, in bridges, in schools, in cities, in all those basic choices. And if you're not doing that with climate change in mind, then you're not building those things to withstand the kinds of impacts that are likely to come your way. So when people don't know about climate change, they're actually more at risk to the issue because you just can't take those longer term strategies into mind. So yes, we do respond, even to just basic variability and change. But in the end, that's not going to be enough for what's coming. Yes, miss. Yeah.
Actually, this is perfect. Just to piggyback off of this gentleman's question. I also interact with a lot of people who live in rural and small town, Midwestern communities who are interested in reducing CO2 emissions as a pollutant. They're interested in renewable energy for whatever reason they may have. They're doing things on their farms to increase their soil carbon content. But in a lot of ways, that runs counter to this very successful disinformation campaign that claims to speak for rural Americans. Can you talk about maybe how important the appropriate messenger is, or how important one-on-one conversations are with family or friends or someone who shares your own values?
Yes.
And then also, have you done any digging into rural American perspectives specifically?
Okay, thank you. All right, so the question is, what's the role of the messenger? What's the role of family networks, friends and family networks? And then the last is, I won't get them all, is, rural America. Okay, so first of all, let me just say thank you for the question because it's really important, is that the messenger often matters more than the message itself. I just can't say that strongly enough. Because in the end, it comes down to trust and credibility. If I don't like you, and I don't trust you, then I don't care what you say, I'm going to dismiss it. And this has actually been one of the really unfortunate things about the way this issue has evolved in the American mind and in American discourse, is that for many people, the first messenger they really ever heard about was not the scientific community, it was Al Gore. And Al Gore, love him or hate him, is one of the most politically polarizing people in America. Okay? So he tried to communicate the science, and he actually did a pretty good job. The Inconvenient Truth did a very good job of communicating the science. It doesn't matter, because most people don't separate Al Gore, polarized politician who was the vice president of, at the time, the most polarizing president we'd had in modern times, Bill Clinton, who then goes on to have the most contested presidential campaign ever against George W. Bush, who then goes on to become an ardent critic of the Bush administration, especially for their Iraq war policy. And yet at the same time, he's talking about the science of climate change. And many people cannot disassociate those two different roles and say, oh, all right, he's full of crap over here, but here he's pretty good. Okay? No, I sometimes make the joke that Al Gore could hold a press conference tomorrow, gather the world's media around him and say, scientists have determined that the world is round. And there are some Americans who would go, well, God damn it, it's flat. Okay? So messenger absolutely matters, and that's one of the reasons, unfortunately, why this issue has become so polarizing. So back to your other really important point is family and friends. Yes. This is ultimately a question that we engage with as part of our social networks. especially in rural America where you're actually dealing with the realities of climate change in a way that people who have white-collar jobs who sit in offices just don't, right? I mean, most of those people, they live in an air-conditioned house, they get in their air-conditioned car, they go to their air-conditioned office building, and then they reverse it to, and then they go to their air-conditioned gym, and so on. I mean, literally, you rarely have to interact with the outside world at all, except maybe to complain a little bit when there's a thunder shower, okay? We're increasingly, sadly, divorced from direct connection with the land and our overall climate system. And that's why, not just here in the United States, but everywhere around the world, rural people, especially farmers, who are the most attuned to the changes in the temperature and in the precipitation, are often our first sentries, our first signals of changes that are happening. Because it's the life and death, literally life and death for many people, especially in subsistence farming communities around the world. So yes, our own family and friends matter a lot. If you are the one person in your family who thinks global warming is real and everybody else around you says, it's just a big liberal hoax, you know, it's hard. It's hard at the Thanksgiving Day table to say, you know, everybody, global warming is a really serious problem. Unfortunately, global warming has become one of those issues like religion and politics that you don't want to talk about at the Thanksgiving Day table because somebody's going to piss off Uncle Bob. Okay? And we don't want to ruin the dinner. Let's see, and your last point is rural Americans. We haven't studied rural Americans specifically, but we see that like the 6 Americas are basically everywhere. Okay? They're not just in California, and they're not just in Texas, and they're not just in North Dakota. They're everywhere in different proportions. You'll find probably a few more dismissives in, say, Lubbock, Texas, than you will in San Francisco, but there are dismissives in San Francisco. They're alarmed in Lubbock. And that's part of the dynamic and wonderful thing about the United States is that we are struggling to come to grips with this issue in our states, in our communities, and even in our families. But don't be afraid to talk about it. Thank you. Yeah. One more question. Sure. Oh, yep. Sorry, you got it.
15 years ago, I participated in a U.S. Department of Agriculture task force on global climate change, which is kind of hard to imagine that USDA actually hosted something like that, considering how far agriculture moved away over the past 10 years. But we finally have got agriculture coming back to the table by talking about it from the point of adaptation and knowing that we have to adapt to a changing climate. And ironically, agriculture probably has adapted more than any other industry to this point. Yeah. Is that an effective strategy for getting the public engaged to talk about adaptation rather than going at it the way we have it historically?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so is talking about adaptation a useful way to get people more engaged? I think so. I think, we were talking about this earlier today with some of the faculty, is that I think actually the community made a strategic mistake years and years ago when there was essentially an unwritten taboo saying, thou shalt not use the word adaptation. And the reasoning was that by bringing up adaptation, they were afraid that it suggests that we don't need to mitigate. You know, we can just adapt our way out of this and we'll be fine. Okay? It's not that serious. Or alternatively, that it's too late, and that's the only thing we can do is adapt. So we don't need to worry about mitigation, which means reducing the emissions in the first place. Prevention, as opposed to just dealing with the after effects, which is essentially what adaptation is. I think that was a big mistake, because adaptation is where most people live. And so this is part of a broader problem, is that in the scientific community, our models, our analysis have all started at the global scale. There's a reason why it was called global climate change, global warming. And yet we know that most people are very intently local. Okay? Most people don't read the New York Times, they don't watch the CBS Evening News, they don't read the Washington Post. They can't, some Americans can't find the Pacific Ocean on a map. They still can't find Iraq or Afghanistan on a map, even though we fought wars there. Most people are born local, they live local, they stay local, they think and care deeply about their own communities. And so then scientists and these others drop in like aliens from another planet, literally speaking different languages, full of things like positive feedback and probability distribution functions and all this kind of stuff, and talking about a global problem and then wondering why don't they understand how important this is. Okay? So I think that actually, and certainly my experience in working with local communities, is that when you start with, here are the kinds of impacts you're already experiencing and you're witnessing, and the vulnerabilities you already know you have to the changes that we've already seen already. And you start there. You've got their attention. They're fully engaged. They're not just listening to somebody. They're saying, let me tell you about what I'm experiencing. And they've got tremendous local knowledge about what's going on right there, then and there. And they're part of a dialogue as opposed to a one-way transmission of information. And then as you lead them through, how are you vulnerable now? What can you do to adapt now? How expensive is that going to be to adapt to what you're already experiencing? And then how would you adapt to a 1-degree world, or a 2-degree world, or a 3-degree world, or a 4-degree world, or God forbid, a 6 or 7-degree centigrade warmer world? And my experience is that when you lead people through that, they suddenly get very interested in mitigation because they realize there's no way we can adapt our way out of the extremes. Okay? So I think it's not something to be avoided. It's actually a front door. It's a way to actually engage people and get them to see why this matters to me at the beginning of the conversation. So, all right, thank you very much.
Please. Thank you. As John said, I think I know all of you. I'm Archie Clutter, Dean of the Agricultural Research Division. We have a tradition as part of the Harriman Lecture Series that we award each of our speakers with a medal. And this is a medal that includes some description of the theme of the Harriman Lectures and provides a memento of our speakers' time spent here at the University of Nebraska. So Dr. Leiserowitz, please accept our thanks for an excellent lecture and this gift from the Harriman Lecture.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes. Oh, such an honor. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, it's lovely.
I want to thank you all for coming. Our next Harriman Lecture is at 3:30 in the afternoon of Tuesday, April 21st. This one will be at Nebraska Innovation Campus. Our speaker is Dr. Rob Fraley. The title of Rob's lecture is 2050, Agriculture's Role in Mitigating Global Challenges. Rob is familiar to many of you. He's Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at Monsanto Company. Rob's been with Monsanto for more than 30 years. He leads their global technology division, so that's plant breeding and biotechnology. It's agricultural biologicals and microbials. It's precision agriculture and crop protection. Rob's won many awards, including being named a World Food Prize laureate in 2013, and he received the National Medal for Technology from President Clinton in 1998. So I've seen him present around the world, and he'll bring an informative and high-energy discussion of the critical importance of biotechnology in achieving global food security. So please join us for that. Thanks again for coming, and have a great afternoon.